by the intellect. So I'm trying not to use, complex words. Actually, I don't know how to use complex words. This is about practical, simple daily living. So there's a bonus in that. And if the intellect hears what I'm saying, the intellect, having been newly conditioned with new information, hopefully starts to observe the dynamics that are being pointed at for itself. So seeing certain external and internal movements and feelings, and hopefully recognizing them based on the descriptions that are put forward here. If the intellect investigates for itself and finds that nothing that's being said actually holds true, then after enough investigation, if you become convinced that what is being said doesn't hold true, I'd move on to something else. But if the concepts do prove themselves as being accurate, based on your own investigation, right? So this means the task, if there's a task, it turns out not to be a task that you have to do, but a task that naturally happens once we've received more information. We can't help but see life in line or out of line with the information. So the task, if there's a task, is to do the investigation for yourself, to actually look on the level of life that is being pointed at. And if the concepts get ticked, if you see, yes, that concept holds true, it makes sense, then it gets a tick next to it. And as the intellectual understanding gets ticked off more and more regularly based on your own observation of life, the understanding automatically goes deeper and deeper. It really means that you get to see something that you didn't see before. And before seeing it, it made sense that you wouldn't really know whether it was true or not. So if someone said, hey, do you know that the lift works a certain way? And if you haven't observed it, you might go, well, I'll have to take your word for it. As you start observing the mechanics of the lift, if it's observable, and you start to see what the person was pointing out, hey, the lift works by a process of wires and motors and what have you. If you happen to be able to see that through the cracks in the door, and as the lift's going up, you see the wires, something you might not have noticed before, you get to put tick next to it and say, yes, I've seen, based on my own investigation, that there are pulleys and wires and things inside the shaft of the lift. And so then next time if someone says, I've got no idea how a lift works, do you know how it works? You'd say, actually, based on my own observation, I can tell you that there is a whole lot of wires and pulleys inside the shaft that pulls the lift up. So, this is a sort of silly example. It's evident more or less to us based on having watched movies and seen the inside of a lift shaft, etc. We sort of think, well, it's just an example of something we may not be familiar with, and then as our attention lands on it, we become familiar with something we weren't previously. And then we can speak confidently about it based on not a concept or a belief that someone else has given us, but a looking for ourselves. And so the concept I started with is what the talks are about, is actually what humans are really looking for, whether we realize it or not. What I mean by whether we realize it or not is there's a strange phenomena that has covered up an understanding of what we're really looking for. And that strange phenomena is this notion I mentioned of what the feeling of uncomfortableness informs us. It informs us that we're looking for outcomes, that something is wrong in circumstance, and when circumstance is improved. So this concept is saying, hey, if you think you're looking for something else, if you think you're seeking for something else, if you're seeking to become a better person, if you're seeking to be able to help others, That's what you might think. Actually, the only reason I'm seeking is to become a better help to others. That's a delusion that life has put in place that is preventing us from actually becoming clear intellectually about what we're looking for. So what the human being is really looking for, whether they realize it or not, is happiness in daily living. And if we don't come to recognize that for ourselves, meaning if we don't go past the ingrained beliefs that say otherwise, that say what I'm really looking for is this or that, then our seeking will continue to be diluted. Our focus will be diluted. And one of the phenomena that prevents freedom, which equates with happiness. So when I use freedom, it's really freedom from beliefs, freedom from suffering. One of the phenomena that prevents freedom is a whole lot of deeply ingrained beliefs. And those beliefs will drive us in certain directions. They'll make us function a particular way. And so this point is harped on. Like someone might say, come on already, you've told us we're looking for happiness, let's get on with it. It's emphasized in every single talk. It's the starting point. Ask ourselves this very important question. What am I really looking for if I find myself as a seeker? It makes sense to ask at some point, actually hopefully the sooner the better, a very practical question. What am I really looking for? And not necessarily run with the first answer that comes to mind, because that first answer is probably what life has conditioned us to believe. Actually, maybe don't stop till you come to this answer. And the answer is, you know what? If I'm really honest, if I put down all of my concepts, all of my beliefs, everything that I've been told by society about what enlightenment is or what the purpose of life is, I find that I've been doing everything in life because I think it's going to make me happy. And when we start seeking, if we're really honest, we say, I'm seeking because I think that when the seeking ends, everything's going to be okay. And the real time we get the answer to this question is not when we're feeling sort of stable and fine, because that's when the ideology about what we think we're looking for can actually seem accurate. We might have the best of intentions, actually, that I want to help people. And so the answer comes up is, no, I really genuinely believe I want to help people. And so that's what I'm seeking. I'm seeking to be a bigger help in life to people. Actually, if we look at it, why we might want to help people so deeply could be coming from this sense of lack. Often, if we go right down to the core of the sense of lack, it's the sense of not being worthy, not being good enough, not being lovable. And then when life unfolds and the other does things that sort of confirm, well, it doesn't really confirm, but if the other does things that is painful, not in line with our preferences, then we take it as confirmation. It feels personal. And we sort of feel even more that I'm not worthy. And we want to be loved by the other. So an idea of wanting to help others can actually come from an imagination that if I can help people in a really deep way, then they're bound to love me. I'm going to be loved by a lot of people. And guess what? That's my happiness. That's the belief. If I help people, they can't help but love me. And my happiness is to be found in love from the other. That's what that uncomfortable feeling inside is telling us. So hopefully at some point, especially when, so as I was saying, if we answer this question when we're feeling relatively balanced, this ideology might come up. When we're really feeling lost and uncomfortable, that's when the true answer might present itself. Because that's our unhappiness. That uncomfortable feeling is our unhappiness. We might not know what happiness is. Right? So if we want to know what happiness is, it could be a good place to start from those times when we can put our hand on our heart and say, in this moment, I'm not happy. It's not a concept. In this moment, I know that I'm not happy. I'm not talking about this moment. I'm talking about some moment when you can go, okay, in this moment, based on how I feel, I am not happy. And then if we look at that, we'll find that it's a form of suffering as it's described in this teaching. And then if we're really honest, we'll say, actually, I just want this feeling to not be here. I just want to be happy. That's when we say, is it true when you're feeling like that, and you can put your hand on your heart and say, I'm not happy, is it true that you just want to help others? Actually, the truth is, I just want this feeling to go away. And so if we find ourselves in the flip-flopping stage of spiritual seeking, which happens when the understanding has gone deep, and we start finding for ourselves that there are moments, extended periods even, of a peace with life, a flow, a sense that actually you're not in resistance to life, where things feel relatively or radically different to what you're used to in the past. And the flip-flopping is where that's present, and then it sort of dissolves and we feel like we've regressed back, and any understanding, which in the periods of flip, when we feel peace, it feels like, I've got it. I see life clearly. I see that, let's say, what the other is doing is not personal. And I see that these painful situations are not an attack on who I am. So we can find ourselves being relatively okay with circumstance. And we go, well, this is really strange. That would have really annoyed me some time back. And we find that we're okay with it. And then the flop is where that understanding seems to go out the window. We feel like we've regressed back, like I've lost any understanding, and the smallest of things tends to aggravate us. And one of the biggest benefits of that flip-flopping is that it gives us an opportunity to confirm for ourselves, based on our own experience. Only if the intellect sort of lands on the makeup of the contrast between the two. So we can go through this flip-flopping for many years and not actually register what I'm talking about. But if the intellect lands on it and it sees the contrast between the periods of peace and then when the suffering comes back, that's when we can see from our own experience, not a concept. It's like, actually, I just want this uncomfortableness to end. I know what the uncomfortableness, the absence of the uncomfortableness feels like. My circumstance hasn't suddenly radically changed. I haven't turned into a millionaire or got a job promotion that I've been waiting for a long time. I just found myself okay with life as it is. And then the flop happens and we're not okay with life as it is. So that's where we can start to see it's not circumstantial, it's attitudinal. And clearly we're not in control of that attitude, because 1 minute, out of the blue, we find, wow, this is really strange. My attitude is such that life isn't resisted. And then the next day, the attitude has changed. And we can say, I've got to change my attitude back, and it doesn't change back until it changes back. Because we're not the ones dictating our relationship to life. We're not in control of what happens in each moment, including our attitude. But the point here is not to show us that we're not in control. That's a useful thing. But the big thing is that, remember I said, test it out from your own experience. So you're not just following a concept that someone has said. The concept is what we're looking for is happiness, and happiness is the end of suffering. The flip-flopping shows us the two side by side. That's when we can put our hands up in the air, like exclaim, actually joyfully in a way, and say, I can truly say that I'm not looking for a radical change in my circumstance. That's what I often believe to be what I'm looking for. But I see that yesterday I just found that life was acceptable, and now it's not. And what I'm looking for is this resistance to life, this uncomfortableness, what I'm calling suffering, to fall away. So once we become clear on that, really clear based on our own appreciation of the fact, then our focus, our attention when seeking, when contemplating, can become really narrow and focused. We don't necessarily need to contemplate the nature of the unmanifest, for example, if we've heard about some concept that talks about the unmanifest. And it says that prior to consciousness, you are the unmanifest. Maybe that's not so important if what we're looking for is happiness in daily living. It might be, but as we go through the explanations, we'll find actually it's not so important. Because we're looking for the end of suffering, and when we look at it in practical terms, suffering arises in 5 fairly specific forms. Guilt, blame, pride. We could sort of put a dividing line there. And then the other half is worry and anxiety. Fear, you could put in there. Expectation and attachment to outcomes. So why I've put a dividing line there is actually overall, overriding these 5 forms of suffering, when we look at them, we could say they're all different forms of the belief in personal doership, which turns out to be the underlying belief that life has put in place that is erroneous, a false idea of who we are. And so the reason it's split, under that umbrella of what we can call doership, there are 2 subset beliefs. One is personal doership, and the other is attachment to outcomes. So the overall umbrella of these beliefs we can call doership. And then underneath that, there's personal doership and attachment to outcomes. So when we look at guilt, blame, and pride, we find that it's a movement, it's an attitude to what has happened as a result of what I did in life or what the other did in life. Guilt, blame, and pride. And it's attitudinal. It arises when an outcome happens as a result of my functioning or the other's functioning. And usually it's to do with negative outcomes, outcomes that are painful to me or someone that I care about. And painful outcomes are by default painful when the circumstance is out of line with my biological preference, part of my biological makeup that I didn't put in place. So that's a way that we can understand what determines whether something is pleasurable or painful. It's simply a result of the biological entity being exposed to a circumstance, and that circumstance, which is not in our control, is either going to be in line with our preferences or out of line with our preferences. If it's in line with our preferences, it's pleasure. If it's out of line with our preferences, it's pain. The suffering is an attitude to what is happening in the flow of life, meaning an attitude to the pleasure or pain in the flow of life. And the suffering in the form of guilt, blame, and pride is based on this attitude or belief that I am the doer of everything that happens through me, that I am a separate, independent entity in control of everything that I think, that I feel, that I say, and that I do. And if we see ourselves that way, then we see the other in the same way, as a separate, independent entity in control of everything that they think, feel, say, and do. The belief dictates that that's how I see myself in each moment, and that's how I see the other. So the blame is a result of that belief. The other delivers pain. I see them as the doer. I say, you could have done it differently. You hurt me, so I hate you. The hate you is I blame you for doing what you did that delivered pain to me or someone that I love. And I'll carry that story of blame for a long time, possibly, based on how important the pain was, how significant it seemed. And clearly, certain pain is far more intense than other pain. So if someone eats your fruit, it's not in line with your preferences. If someone were to, burn your house down, the pain of those two events is significantly different. And so the intensity of the pain can sometimes determine how long and how intense the suffering and the hatred is. But actually, the hatred, the blame, is only there because of the attitude of personal doership. It's not there because of the pain itself. That's the really good news, because if our suffering was actually a result of circumstance, then we would require some magic to happen somewhere along the line where life was magically pleasure, 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 pleasure. So it would mean that my happiness is determined and reliant on life one day becoming pleasure, 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 pleasure. And a simple objective looking at the flow of life makes it very clear that the flow of life is not in my control, and clearly sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. I'm going to get sick from time to time. People I love are going to get sick. People I love are going to die. People that I love are going to decide that they want to move in a different direction. Things that I own are going to get old and break. People are going to steal things. I'm going to get old and break the body. So no matter how we try to control life, we can see based on our own experience that it's uncontrollable. So the good news, really good news, is that our happiness is attitudinal and not circumstantial. It means life doesn't have to change. If it was circumstantial, basically, we should hang our boots up and say, actually, I'm not seeking anymore because this happiness that I'm seeking is unavailable. The nature of the flow of life is pleasure sometimes and pain at others. And therefore, if my happiness is based on life being pleasure, 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 I just have to admit, I have to accept that happiness for the human being is not available in this life. That would be the conclusion. So this is the great news, is my happiness and suffering is always attitudinal and not circumstantial. So what it requires is for life to change the attitude, the belief that life has put in place that is the basis of our attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. And so if we investigate this belief in doership and attachment to outcome, if we came to the conclusion, actually this belief in doership and attachment to outcome is valid, it's accurate, then we better hang our boots up again and say happiness isn't available in life. But when we look at the basis of the belief in doership and the attitude in doership, the attitude, remember I'm saying, is the attitude which sees the other as the doer and myself as the doer. Therefore, when the other delivers pain, I have to hate them. When I deliver an outcome that is painful, I have to hate myself, feel guilt and shame. And similarly, when seeing myself as a doer, if I perform a task and the outcome is positive, then I have to feel pride. Look what I achieved. Look how good I am. And pride feels less uncomfortable than suffering. In fact, some people would say pride feels good. When you really start to feel in and see its connection to the other forms of suffering, and see that pride creates a sense of superiority and inferiority, then we'll start to see actually that's not a positive thing. We'll start to feel into the sense of pride and see it's very much linked to the more dense forms of suffering. So if we investigate this notion of personal doership that life has ingrained in us and see if it's accurate, see if it's true, from two different perspectives, we can start to see it's not true. If life creates a shift in perspective, what we could call an awakening experience, then from that awakening perspective, that witnessing perspective, impersonal witnessing, not the witnessing that a body does of external objects, that would be more akin to what I would call observing. But if an awakening happens, then what tends to happen is the subject in that experience changes quality, and it becomes apparent that the body is not really the subject. In a way, that shift blows the consciousness, the center of consciousness, out of its centricness with the body for a while. And from that point of view, it sort of demonstrates that what I am is not part of the flow of life. But what I am is observing, witnessing the flow of life happening. And it doesn't require any intellect. It's demonstrated firsthand, directly, experientially. Now, the problem with these awakenings can be that we can have that direct shift in consciousness, and the intellect might not even recognize the implications of this shift. Meaning the beliefs of personal doership remain ingrained, even though experientially life is being seen quite differently. Life is being seen to be a happening, and the body, which previously was heavily identified with as being the subject and the doer of everything, is seen to be functioning much more mechanically in life. Sort of, it's an object that is moving in line with the complete movement of the flow of life. And from that perspective, life can be more peaceful because there's less involvement in what is happening. Experientially, when that witnessing is happening, without us needing to conceptualize anything, the attachment and the identification breaks away, and so the suffering ceases when that witnessing is pronounced. But a phenomena that happens is that we tend to find ourselves coming in and out of that witnessing, where the witnessing stops and there's a centricness back into the body and an attachment with what is happening again. And if the intellect hasn't taken cue from that witnessing perspective, then the beliefs in doership haven't been dissolved, and the suffering continues to arise. And that's another reason of this flip-flopping happening, because the belief in doership hasn't been dissolved, even though we find ourselves having experiences of witnessing life as a happening. Now, that can sound like, oh, I better get one of these experiences or shifts so that life can be known to be a happening and not my doing. And it's not necessary. There's many different ways that the process of transformation can happen. The process essentially is a process of dissolving these ingrained beliefs. And the witnessing or the peak experiences, the awakening, is one way that life can start to demonstrate that fact. And sometimes we can get put over importance in that experience, because those experiences, when they happen, have a sense of oneness, non-separation, reveal that what I am in essence is consciousness or awareness, not the body. And it's exactly what a lot of top-down, beautiful, profound teachings are talking about. And so when the experience happens, it makes sense that we say, this is it. This is the shift that so many masters have spoken about. It's the shift that so many masters are pointing at, witnessing. And not only witnessing, but this talk about oneness. And so then it's assumed if that happens, or if it hasn't happened. If it happens, we say, this is it. And then when it fades away, we wait for it to come back. We say, so one day when the process is finished, that experience, that decentralized witnessing of life, will come back and stay forever. And if it hasn't happened, we might have heard descriptions about it, and descriptions that talk about its importance, in a way, what I described as seeing everything as a happening. And we become fixated with saying, well, this is what needs to happen for me. The process can take a different path. It can take a path of allowing the doership to unfold without a very pronounced awakening experience. Liberation isn't about a oneness experience. It's not even about the realization of oneness. And because that realization can be a significant step along the way, sometimes it's pointed at as being about that. In the scriptures, there is a very useful pointer. It says, don't mistake understanding for realization, and don't mistake realization for liberation. The awakening is akin with realization. It is a recognition of what the core of the human being is, awareness, consciousness, in such a way that that core moves to center stage, whereas it was more integrated previously and therefore not seen. So the awakening experience sort of demonstrates that, and it also demonstrates that life is just a happening, unfolding impersonally, not my doing and not the other's doing. That's the realization. Don't mistake realization for liberation. Liberation is not that state of oneness, although there is a liberation quality in it, because in that state of oneness and witnessing, the peace is there. And so because the peace is there in that form, and sometimes it's the first time that we've experienced peace, we say, so they're synonymous with each other. But what if peace can be available without that oneness experience being prevalent? And in fact, that's what the liberation, in my experience, is. It's a movement away from impersonal witnessing of life, such that the movement is to come back to living as Roger, as the human being. Frankly, so much so that you start to question what that experience actually proved. For a while we might say that it proved a whole lot of things. It proved that life is a dream, all arising in consciousness, made of consciousness, and that there's nothing outside of consciousness. And that can be part of the movement from realization to liberation. At some point, we find that even that notion is questioned. Did it really prove that? Or was it a shift in consciousness? Could it have been a shift of the body's consciousness, such that the world, life was experienced differently, qualitatively differently, accompanied by a certain story of what that qualitative shift meant, and then we believe that story. And the reason is that so the teachings are there to undo mistakes. They're not the truth. The teachings themselves tell us that. Don't mistake the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself. Don't believe what I have to say. So in this teaching, it's made really clear and simple. It says whatever is put forward is a concept. Whatever anyone in history has put forward is a concept. No one has ever uttered a word of truth. The only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. So that means that what the Vedas say, or the Bible says, or the most enlightened human being is a pointer. And it's not necessarily true. Sometimes the teachings require us to take it as true in order to move down the process. And then something will happen that will get us to question whether I'm interpreting it properly. Maybe I'm interpreting it too rigidly. And Ramana's teaching addresses this dynamic, this phenomena that happens, whereby a spiritual teaching progresses us down a path, so it's very valuable, but then the teaching itself tends to become embedded as a new belief system. And so in this analogy or this saying, which is an analogy, the thorn represents a concept, a spiritual concept, well, any concept, but you'll see in one context it refers to a spiritual concept. And when the thorn is embedded in the thumb, it refers to a concept that has been turned into a belief, a concept that has been grabbed hold of too enthusiastically, too rigidly, and set in place as a belief. So Ramana pointed out, because of a recognition that this phenomena is bound to happen. It's the way humans function until we are changed enough. We function by turning what we're told into beliefs. We don't recognize the relativity of things easily. And so we turn them into something, we relate to them as though they're something absolute. But so much of life, nearly all of life, is relative. And we don't relate to it as relative, we relate to it as absolute. So the saying is, don't use this thorn to remove the thorn which is embedded in your thumb. So use this spiritual concept to remove the belief that has been put in place. But then be sure to throw both thorns away. Implying that what is likely to happen, or what can easily happen, is that second thorn, that is a concept used to uproot the first thorn, can become embedded in your thumb itself as a new belief. So liberation is not a state of oneness, but rather the culmination, the implications that are revealed because of that awakening. And then once that has been revealed sufficiently, the state can come back to being one that is centric in the body. The witnessing in its pronounced way actually fades away. And if we don't understand what's happening, we think that the fading away is a loss. I've lost something. I have to get it back. And then all the efforts are there to try and get us to have this continuous state of consciousness that is experientially revealing a oneness, experientially revealing that what the subject is consciousness. And so we're convinced it's about that state. But what if that state can fade away and you can find yourself at peace? Then we'd say, well, actually, why do I need that state? What we're really looking for is happiness for the human being, happiness in daily living, which is simply the end of suffering. So all of this, because I said we can start to investigate this notion of doership two ways. One, from a shift in consciousness that may or may not happen. Well, if it doesn't happen, we can't, but if it does happen, we can verify it from that shift that happens. Verify that life is a happening, a flow, and that I'm not the doer and the other isn't the doer. The body is then seen to be an object functioning automatically, not because I make it function. Because in that state, what I am is simply witnessing, not doing, and the body continues to function automatically. The other way is for us to observe life by using some conceptual pointers and see whether the belief in personal doership still holds true when we start seeing the human being a little differently based on some pointers. Pointers that don't require a shift in consciousness, don't require an experiential shift of experience. They just require us to apply some critical thinking, which in itself, in time, will start to create a witnessing in a much more subtle sense in life, because the concepts will relegate the biological and psychological movements of the body into a category that is seen to be automatic functioning, which is very different to how we've felt ourselves to be. We've felt that we are the controllers of the words coming out of our mouth. And so if we get a concept that says actually the human being in any moment is one way, is shaped, exists one way, meaning that they're a unique instrument in that moment. And the human instrument, the body and the mind, is based on two factors, the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So the genetic structure, or genes, refers to how the body grows, the blood type, the strength of the heart or the weakness of the heart, the IQ, the capacity of the eyes to function at very high standards or not. All of that, even down to temperament of being irritable or patient, all of that can be categorized as part of the genetics. And when we look at it, we see that the body comes into existence when the sperm and egg come together, and then that forms a single unit, and that unit grows. And so the body on a genetic level is a result of growth, not a result of me doing anything. And at a certain point, the heart gets to a point where it starts functioning, and the brain gets to a point where it starts working, and we're born, and on it goes. The body keeps growing, and how it grows, not my doing. It happens. And as soon as the body starts growing, it starts being influenced by external factors, what we can call new conditioning in each moment. And that new conditioning never stops. In each moment we're receiving new conditioning. So Ramesh used to say, and so much of what I share is the teaching that Ramesh used to put forward. Ramesh used to say, make no mistake, what is being delivered here is simply new conditioning. The concepts are life delivering new conditioning. Now, we often have this idea that conditioning is the problem. And we might have this idea, actually, I want to be deconditioned. Why am I here receiving more conditioning? That's a fairly rudimentary concept, that the problem is conditioning. Actually, the problem is conditioning, but the problem is not all conditioning. The human body is a conditioned instrument. So we know how to eat with a knife and fork because of conditioning. We know how to drive a car because of conditioning. We know how to speak because of conditioning. We know how to do mathematics because of conditioning. We know how to interact well or not so well with others because of conditioning. If we actually got what we prayed for, if we prayed for please decondition me, we would be in a lot of trouble because we wouldn't be able to function in life at all. So it's very important to see that the conditioning that is a problem is a very specific type of conditioning. This conditioning that I'm referring to as the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes. So the body, the human in each moment, is essentially one way based on these two factors, their genes and their up-to-date conditioning, that I and you are never in control of. So you came to the talk today and you didn't know what I was going to talk about, specifically, exactly. Frankly, I didn't know exactly what I was going to talk about. And if a bird flies across the vista, that's not something we're in control of, and it can become it is part of our new conditioning. We might see a bird we've never seen before. It's new conditioning. And that's happening all the time in life. And so if we start to see the human being as an instrument designed by or created up to a certain point in time, shaped by life based on these two factors, genes and up-to-date conditioning, two factors I haven't been in control of. And therefore, in a particular moment, I find myself in a circumstance that I'm not in control of. And we can equate it to the example of two chemicals coming together. Each chemical has its chemical composition that it didn't choose. And when the two chemicals come together, there's a reaction. It might be an inert reaction or a violent reaction or something in between. And it's not personal. It's not that the two chemicals didn't sit down and have a conference, like how are we going to react? Or one chemical didn't think how I'm going to... It just happens based on the makeup in that moment and the circumstance. And so the human being is like a very complex version, unique, complex version of these chemicals. And we find ourselves in situations, in circumstance. We find ourselves interacting with other humans that are shaped by life up to that very moment, genes and up-to-date conditioning. So our up-to-date conditioning is the cumulative effect of all of the new conditioning that we receive in each moment. And so our up-to-date conditioning is continually changing, never the same. And so certain new conditioning can radically change our up-to-date conditioning. So these concepts that are putting forward, it's fair to say, they're not what we generally hear out on the street in life. So it's new conditioning that could radically change the existing conditioning. It's actually that simple. Even if we have an awakening experience that demonstrates certain things, if what is demonstrated doesn't actually sink down and uproot the beliefs in personal doership and attachment to outcome, what happens is you'll find someone who would say, I had an awakening experience. I have awoken back in 1997. No doubt I had an awakening experience. And yet I find myself, 20 years later, still suffering. They might not even recognize that, and they might think that the shift and the recognition that this is all a dream, which I'm not saying it is, from that perspective, it could be supported that it's a dream, arising in consciousness. And they might be fixated still on a returning of that awakening experience, which is probably why 20 years later they're still finding themselves living life suffering, waiting for that awakening experience to come back, to happen, thinking that when it happens, then everything's going to be okay. So my point is that if the awakening experience happens, it can be a way that the ingrained beliefs get uprooted. Or it can happen and the ingrained beliefs don't get uprooted. The important part is not the awakening, but that it uproots the beliefs. And so if you can uproot the beliefs, not you, but if life can uproot the beliefs a different way, who cares about an awakening experience? It's an important point. Do you have a question? Yeah. Okay, good. Well, actually, if people have a question, there's a microphone, and for the sake of the recording, if you can speak into the microphone, there's a little button halfway down. If you hold it for a second or two, the green light will come on, and when you're finished, you can turn it off again. So if anyone, I've given the principles now of the teaching, the framework. If I open up for questions before the framework, we might end up talking about all sorts of things that get clarified with the framework. So anyone who has a question, you're welcome to ask it. So if we go back to the investigation of the human being as being an instrument in each moment that is shaped by life according to genes and up-to-date conditioning, so we can understand that intellectually, hopefully. And then as we contemplate it more and more, and at the same time living life, so you don't have to go into a monastery or anything like that. This is the beauty of some seeking, is you can just, it happens while you're living your life, doing whatever you need to do day to day. So if you find yourself living life ordinarily, and attention and the working mind, so I'm speaking to the working mind at the moment, the part of the mind that is not being told to do anything. What I'm putting forward are not prescriptions for you to achieve. They're just descriptions of dynamics. And those descriptions become part of the working mind. And if they become part of the working mind, then the working mind has the predisposition to start seeing a dynamic in life that it hasn't seen before. It might see a reaction that happens in the body-mind organism, and it will ask, could it be that this is based on how I am in this moment, and that how I am in this moment is not my doing? I didn't control how I am in this moment. Could it be? Could it be that it's simply a result of my genetic makeup and how I grow, and how life has affected me, the family I was born into, the religious beliefs, the political situation, the school I went to, the friends I made, the rules I was told to follow, the values that were instilled in me, the events and circumstances that happen. And as these reactions happen, we might start to see that they're not in my control. They happen much more automatically than I've given credit to in the past. And I might see that, yes, I'm judging that person for, I don't know, not wearing shoes, or for eating with their mouth open, because of the conditioning that I received at home. And had I received different conditioning at home, I may not well, I would be different, and I may not judge that person for eating with their mouth open. And so this is simply about seeing a dynamic, going, wow, it's not about saying, oh, I should stop judging the person for eating with their mouth open. This is about seeing a dynamic and going, I'm not interested in being a perfect human being. I'm just interested in seeing the dynamic of life, the dynamic of the movements that happen through me that I was convinced were my doing. What might start to happen, which is a form of witnessing, is that we start to relate to words that are coming out of the body, feelings that are arising in the body, as a feeling arising in a body-mind organism, not a concept where we say, oh, that's a feeling arising in a body-mind organism. But if we actually find that there is a watching, which can happen if the movement is seen to be automatic, mechanical, not my doing. As it's seen more and more that way, then the strange thing is that the movements in the body can start to be witnessed. Just like the movements in the other person then will start to be seen as a happening and not their doing. We might start to see the mechanics of two people having an argument. And witnessing life like that, a bit like when you witness a tree moving, you see it as physics or nature. And this witnessing of everything happening as a happening in a body-mind organism, not everything, but all of the feelings, all of the emotions, even the suffering that arises, which is based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning. So it's not about setting an objective of, oh, I heard that happiness for the human being is the end of suffering, and so now I am going to achieve the end of suffering. That would be the doership belief that is convinced it is what is controlling life, kicking into place. What we're talking about here is witnessing or recognizing everything that happens in the body, including the suffering, as a happening, not my doing. And if we realize it's a happening, I didn't create it, then it's not my job to get rid of it. If I think it's my job to get rid of it, what happens is we're missing the very fact of how things happen. So this isn't to say that I witness suffering as a happening and then it doesn't change. The very movement away from the belief in personal doership is change. And remember, what I'm suggesting is I'm talking to the working mind. The other distinction of mind is what we could call the thinking mind. The thinking mind is the part of the mind that creates all the suffering, all of the resistance, all of the guilt, the blame, the pride, the expectation and the attachment to outcomes, and the worry and the anxiety. That part of the mind is the attitude to life that creates suffering. So if we see that life is continually conditioning the thinking mind and the working mind, then we might come to appreciate that I'm not telling anyone to do anything. I'm just throwing out concepts that I'm destined to throw out based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance I find myself in. And those concepts land or they don't land, not in your control, not in my control. And then as a result of the new makeup of the body, which is mechanical, automatic, the thinking happens according to the new makeup. So the witnessing of a feeling arising as a happening in the body-mind organism is not something you do. It's something that happens based on your makeup in that moment. And if suffering arises, suffering is arising because of your makeup in that moment. And if the working mind understands this principle, then it will witness the suffering as a happening, not insist that the suffering be gone. That would be what the thinking mind will do. The thinking mind is the part of the mind that has been conditioned to resist life that is unpleasant or uncomfortable, thinking that it is in control of life, that it can determine how life is. The thinking mind believes life should be a certain way, so that's expectation. So if the working mind gets conditioned appropriately, it starts to see the thinking mind in action, which is suffering. Hopefully it actually then understands, this can't be different. It's my makeup in this particular moment functioning. And the very recognition of this is change. It's change from the obsession with personal doership and controlling life to now life having brought about sufficient new conditioning for the body to function differently, for the mind to function differently. And that shift means that the suffering that arises will probably be less intense because there is some understanding. And the understanding is, it's not even so much a mental understanding. It starts off as a intellectual understanding, as new conditioning in the working mind. In the end, it turns out to be just a natural witnessing. The new conditioning starts to cut off the old conditioning, and what it leaves is a natural witnessing of life. So this freedom, this peace of mind, isn't a conceptual peace of mind. What it is recognizing that suffering is conceptual. Suffering is an attitude to what's happening in the flow of life based on an error. The process brings in new conditioning on the level of mind. That new conditioning starts to see the existing conditioning as inaccurate and starts to cut it off. And once it cuts it off, it too falls away. So we find moments of stillness and quiet that are not a stillness of thinking. It's a stillness of the quietening of thinking. The quietening of the thinking mind, and at times when the working mind isn't required, even the working mind stops. And there's a being, a recognition, what I am is here prior to thinking. And what I am is actually complete and peaceful in this moment. What seemed to be a problem, the thinking mind that was creating a story about what it meant that the other person did this and what it means that I didn't get the job promotion. All of that story might start to be seen as the functioning of the thinking mind. It might get cut off quicker and quicker based on the working mind popping up, saying something like, actually your happiness isn't to be found in circumstance. That cuts off the thinking mind. And then the working mind itself can stop. And we find ourselves remembering, in a sense you could say, remembering who I am at my core. And having a smile come over, I say, because we realize, it's quiet, it's peaceful. It was just that story that was the uncomfortableness. And then experientially we start seeing that my happiness is not dependent on circumstance. The circumstance remains more or less the same as the circumstance when the story was functioning. Maybe you lost your job, you didn't get the promotion, whichever it was. That's the circumstance. That hasn't magically changed. The story, which is your attitude to the circumstance, was very uncomfortable. If the working mind and awareness recognize this uncomfortable story and recognize it as doership and attachment to outcome, and the thought arises, my happiness simply isn't to be found in circumstance, based on previous experience. The previous experience could be when we dropped into being and remembered ourselves and smiled and went, here I am. Circumstance as it was, here I am. And the more that happens, the more confirmation we get that my happiness isn't to be found in circumstance. So then the thought that arises, my happiness isn't to be found in circumstance, isn't just a concept. It's something that has been confirmed based on our own experience. So we end up remembering ourselves, remembering where we are at home much more frequently and going there. And what we find is a demonstration that I am complete. I am unaffected at my core by circumstance. And the same can happen if I found myself blaming the other as the doer, or being too critical on something that I did that delivered a negative outcome, so guilt or shame. The thought might arise, you're not the doer and the other's not the doer. And we remember, come back. It's just that thought, the working mind, is just a reminder to come back to being. So it becomes the bookend of the thinking mind. The thinking is saying, I hate them for what they did, they've attacked me, they've diminished who I am, I'm never going to forgive them. And then awareness and the working mind recognize that story, and the thought is, your happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, and they're not the doer. It's just a reminder to come back. Here I am. And the working mind isn't an interference with this peace. Once we end up being grounded in being, because we've remembered and gone back there enough times, and actually dropped from the head to the heart, the center of consciousness, actually, it's a good exercise to imagine it, to visualize it as dropping down from the head into the chest area. Just like gravity is pulling it down, it's quite happy to go there, it's home. But with the belief in doership and expectation, it doesn't make sense to rest in being, because if I'm resting in being, well, I'm not using my thinking mind that wants to control. So I bet that's a waste of time to be in being from the perspective of the thinking mind. So we're always in our head. So to allow the center of consciousness to just gravitate down into the heart, an open gaze, soft open gaze can accompany that. And the mind tends to quieten down. And if we find ourselves resting in this being, we can find that we can still think using the working mind, the functional mind. So we could still answer a question that someone asks, but remain grounded in the heart. And that means that we answer the question and the movement is witnessed as a happening, and it doesn't disturb our being. So the idea that peace of mind is the end of thinking is oversimplistic. Peace of mind is the end of the thinking mind. The working mind is going to be very much needed in order to work out a whole lot of things in life. What groceries to buy when you go to the shop, how much money to take on holiday with you, even deciding whether you should change your money at that exchange place or wait till you get to the other place to get a better exchange rate. All of those can be functional thinking, that as long as we're not attached to the outcomes, understanding that the outcome finally is not in my control. If I decide to wait to change money at a different exchange place, I may not end up with a better result. So if I understand the outcome is not in my control, then that's the functional thinking of the thinking mind, of the working mind. The thinking mind is very attached to outcomes. So if it doesn't get what it wants, it sees that as an attack rather than just pleasure or pain in the moment. And you might start to see that this is a radical but simple shift in how we see life, how we see ourselves. Essentially, it's the falling away of the false self-image, the incorrect self-image that says, I am the doer, and that what I am is essentially just a physical entity that requires pleasure instead of pain, that is added to based on receiving pleasure and attacked based on life delivering pain. That's the false self-image. And so what's being pointed at here is a radical different way of, very simple, just non-doership and non-attachment. And why is it emphasized? Because what we're looking for is happiness in daily living. Happiness is peace of mind. Peace of mind is the end of suffering. Suffering arises in practical terms in the form of guilt, blame and pride, worry, anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome. Based on the belief I'm the doer and the other is the doer, guilt, blame and pride. Based on the belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome. If those deeply ingrained beliefs get uprooted, the basis on which guilt, blame and pride is not there. And so that error, which life put in place as part of this story of evolution, then if that gets dissolved, then the suffering isn't there. The error gets dissolved and the subsequent error, the expression of the error, falls away. That's why we've been told for thousands of years, enlightenment is available. It's actually our birthright. What that means, our birthright means that enlightenment, which in practical terms is happiness in daily living, the end of suffering, is the very nature of the core of the human being. So no human being has been born with anything missing, anything that is required for liberation that they don't have. Every human being at its core has consciousness, and the reason that we can be happy in life is because the core of the human being is untouched by circumstance, and it's self-contenting, self-fulfilling, complete. And at its core, there's the sense of I am, I exist, and awareness of the moment. And it's actually this innate sense of existence. That's what we come back to all the time. That's why we end up being happy. We're not happy because I will always exist. For a while I thought that the happiness was there because, what I am will always exist. Even death won't touch it. I don't know that death won't eliminate the consciousness that is present right now. What I know is the consciousness is present right now, and what it turns out is that the core of the human being, the consciousness, is self-content with its existence right now. It isn't self-content because it will exist tomorrow. It really doesn't care about its existence tomorrow. What it is self-content with is its existence now. I am. I exist now. So if we found ourselves in really unfortunate circumstance, accused of a crime we didn't commit, sentenced to life imprisonment, what is being put forward here is saying that in theory, our happiness is still available, even given that life circumstance. Why I say in theory is because in practice, if the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome is still in place, there's going to be all sorts of resistance to what has happened, all sorts of blame towards society and the individuals involved in the accusations and the conviction, guilt maybe for what we failed to do at certain points in our defense. and expectation about how life should look in order for me to be happy. And so then with that set of beliefs, that identity, it's a recipe for disaster if we've been condemned to life in prison, which is going to be a whole lot more pain than living life here. But frankly, if those beliefs are in place, it's a recipe for disaster if we find ourselves in daily living outside of prison as well. Because life is not going to unfold as we expect it to unfold. It's not going to be pleasure, 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 pleasure. The other is going to deliver pain. We're going to still be the same imperfect human beings that don't get everything right. So the freedom, regardless of your circumstance, comes from this shifting in attitude, and it's not our doing. And it's not something that I say, okay, I'm going to shift my attitude. That's the doership coming back in again. But there's no reason to be pessimistic, because this is what Ramesh would often say, that even though you're not the doer, even though life is, we could say, a predetermined story, a creation unfolding moment after moment after moment, exactly as it's destined to unfold. And our freedom from suffering will be there when it's destined to be there, not a moment before or a moment after. So it's not you that can create a shift in attitude. Life creates the shift in attitude. And we might hear this and go, oh, this is terrible news. This is very sad. But when we look at the circumstance, Ramesh would say, no need to be pessimistic. Life has put you in this situation right now. Not you. You didn't put yourself in this situation as the doer. But as a result of circumstance and your genes and up-to-date conditioning, a whole lot of feelings and thoughts arose that drove you to be here. Listening to a set of concepts that life is throwing out, concepts that you're not generally exposed to, concepts that are specifically aimed at highlighting the dynamic of life, specifically relative to this question of human happiness, and pointing out the dynamics of human unhappiness. That's how life brings about the change. So in fact, Ramesh used to joke around and say, in a way, we're God's favorites. I'll keep talking if no one asks a question. Okay, great. Right at the back for starters.
Basically, as I understand, or what I hear is that acceptance and surrender both will be necessary. Whatever life throws at you, you have to accept, but with an understanding and not with helplessness. Or I think our commitment is to surrender into the unfolding of whatever is happening in life. Mm-hmm. That commitment should be there, to surrender into the unfolding of the life. I share an happening which happened this morning only. I'm coming from Mumbai, so I was at the station in the waiting room, and I thought that I'll have some peace of mind, because there were about 40 people in the waiting room. They were all very quiet. It was early in the morning, at about 6:30, 6:45. As I took my seat, I saw that there was a person, and again the judgment immediately comes, that is mentally challenged. And he was abusing, speaking. He was the only one who was doing all this. The rest, about 30 people, were all very quiet, nobody doing anything. And I started looking at my own feelings at that time. And I realized that I had irritation, no doubt. I had also sort of an empathy for the person. I mean, feeling that poor thing, he doesn't know what he's speaking. But the irritation was there. So that's basically suffering, as I understand. Now, this is one situation where circumstances have thrown something. I mean, I was not knowing while I was walking into that waiting room that this will happen. And no sooner I got out of the waiting room, I felt again very quiet. Even though there was a bustling Mumbai railway station, but still I felt very quiet. So every time one has to be aware of what is happening within himself. Is it necessary?
Not as a prescription, not as a practice, not as something you have to work hard at. It's something that can start to happen as we become more and more aware of the various dynamics. So actually it becomes something happens spontaneously. So if we approach this as a practice that I have to become very good at, I have to remain aware all the time, then that in itself is the doer principle, the achiever, the one practicing. And so if we recognize that movement and see it as the doer and relax, it's like if you don't find yourself aware, it's not your doing. So you relax. And the understanding of this actually means you are more aware, because the doer has relaxed. So the doer thinks it's helpful. It's functioning because it believes this is how I'm going to get somewhere in life. If I just relax, then, of course nothing's going to happen. It's that's not recognizing how life actually unfolds. You get taken through life. Even if you stop trying to control, what you find is the body still functions biologically and moves in a particular direction according to its makeup. But now without the attitudinal insistence on where it moves and what life looks like. So often, if I talk about the falling away of the attitude of attachment to outcomes, the question could be, so if I don't have this attitude of attachment to outcomes, how am I going to function in life? And it's a good question. It just simply comes because we haven't recognized that when the attitude falls away, there's still the biological makeup, which is what moves us through life. And there's a great intelligence in that biological makeup.
Whatever you said last, the great intelligence, it seems to be operating because I had very few experiences. Suddenly, if I have to tackle a situation, and there are a lot of advices coming from left and right that you should address like this, you should speak like this. And I don't think about it. Mm-hmm. I say, whatever is going to happen, let us see. Of course, I keep on listening to all of them. It is not that I do not listen to them. Mm-hmm. And suddenly when I go there, and something comes out, and that something is actually much better than what I would have prepared and thought and done.
Yeah.
And it tremendously surprised me. And at that point in time, I felt that there is a greater intelligence which is working than the intelligence, or whatever you call it, that I have.
That's the unintelligence that is trying to control, in a sense.
So these happens when you surrender. Does it happen that way?
Yeah.
Not surrender with an idea that this should happen.
That's right. That's different.
That is not the purpose.
That's manipulation, right?
Yeah, that is manipulation, right? Yeah. But if it happens, in Hindi we call it sahaj, sort of a thing, which happens automatically. Mm-hmm. And then these kind of experiences may reinforce that you should surrender to whatever. It is not that you don't prepare, it is not that you don't do work, but whatever is to happen will happen, and don't worry about what is going to happen.
Yes.
That was the central point there.
That's right.
My job is to just go, address, talk, and see whatever comes out, comes out.
Yes. And the intelligence, actually, it's not such a mystery. It's based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning, your biological genes and up-to-date conditioning. So if you've gone to school and studied management and you've had 50 years experience in the field of management, that's the intelligence that comes out when you get asked a question. If you've surrendered your thinking mind, actually, I want to make a point about what you said about surrender and acceptance. If that surrender has happened, the surrender of the thinking mind that is worried about controlling your answer and controlling how people perceive you, if that surrender has happened, what we find is that the intelligence that is your biological makeup functions really well in life. As you said, much more efficiently than with the added interference of the shoulds and shouldn'ts.
But I never thought it that way, that, this is the biological and genetic or whatever the conditioning response which is coming out. And
Yeah.
That's a fantastic new concept for me.
Yeah, but it makes sense, and
It does make
yeah,
sense.
there is some aspect of our movement that seems to be much more mystical as well. Sometimes we find ourselves speaking in a way that we have no experience of speaking of before, and we wonder, where did this come from? And so, once again, I would still say that's part of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, but maybe something that was locked away a long time ago. Maybe there is past life influence.
Is it possible of a collective consciousness?
Yes.
That there is something there which my mind might have picked it up at that point in time, and I'm open.
Yeah, why not? But still, I would describe it as your genes and up-to-date conditioning, and that collective consciousness effectively is part of your up-to-date conditioning, because it's part of a data bank that is available to you. Yeah? So we don't need to believe in one thing or another, in past lives or collective consciousness. We just say, actually, what happens as a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, and we have a broad openness as to what all of that could be. What it could be influenced by. But as long as we understand, but I'm not in control of those two factors. And there's a great, as we surrender and you start to see the intelligence, the effectiveness of how the body functions, the intelligence of the absence of the resistance and the hatred and the guilt, then the old idea that I have to control life gets weaker and weaker and weaker. And then the surrender of the thinking mind makes more and more sense. Because we see from experience that the thinking mind, so I don't know if I just said the surrender of the working mind, I meant the surrender of the thinking mind makes more and more sense, because we see that it doesn't add the value we thought it added. So
one thing is becoming very clear from what you said is that at that point in time, just now I'm thinking about it, at that point in time, I had no judgment about the people to whom I'm going to address. I have preconceived notion because I knew all of them. Mm-hmm. But at that point in time, I said, no, it's open. Let them speak, let me speak, and let us see how it comes out, whatever. Mm-hmm. And it went on beautifully well. I mean, it was one of the experiences that I would cherish for quite some time.
Yeah.
So what you are saying is correct, that prejudged notions of attachment, of hate, of dislike, not hate but dislike, they were not there. They were not there.
Yeah. So what you're saying by let's see what the outcome is, that's another way when you look at it, it's really dropping your attachment to outcome. Attitudinally, you're saying, I'll leave that in God's hands. And we've seen in the Bhagavad Gita or all over the places, you have actions, but you are not responsible for the fruits of your actions. And so that really means let's act in each moment and see what happens.
Thank you. I got much more clarity.
Just 2 points quickly on what you said about surrender and acceptance. Because you said, what I'm hearing is that we need to surrender and accept. At the very beginning. And an important point is here, I'm not telling someone to surrender or accept. If you were to take that on as a mission, it's a problem. surrender and acceptance are always something that happened to you. You get surrendered, right? You can't do surrendering. And acceptance also is something you can't do. Acceptance is simply what is there when non-acceptance doesn't arise. So if we try to, I must accept, we're not recognizing that, no, acceptance is simply the absence of non-acceptance. It's not a doing. It's the space that is naturally there when non-acceptance doesn't happen. And the other point is that when you were in the waiting room and this person was making noise and you said there was irritability.
Yes, there was.
That irritability could quite easily be a biological reaction and not necessarily suffering. The suffering is what would probably happen simultaneous to it, which is more of the judgment, because you can find yourself in a situation that circumstantially is not in line with your preferences, and the biological reaction to that could be irritation, lack of patience. And as long as it's seen to make sense based on the circumstance, and if we can feel the difference between pain, biological pain, and in that case it would fit under the category of emotional pain, irritation probably, which is not suffering. So if we start to feel the difference between just pain without suffering versus the suffering which comes in when we find a circumstance that is delivering pain and then we judge the circumstance as it should be different, this shouldn't be happening, then that's the suffering on top of the irritation, which might just be biological pain. So it requires us to become more and more fine-tuned, discerning, that's the word, between pain in the moment, which is biological, and suffering. And so yesterday one of the themes was anger and sadness are biological reactions, not psychological reactions. So psychological reactions mean the thinking mind and suffering. And anger can arise in a situation. If someone spills coffee over you, the idea that we just will not have a biological reaction, right? That we will be equanimitous on a biological level is a misconception. Because we're convinced that happiness is to be found in outcomes. Sometimes we have this notion that fits in and says, when I'm enlightened, I will not have any preference. And therefore we imagine us to be this essentially equanimitous being on a biological level. But if someone spills coffee on you, it's like, oh, that's going to happen, It's hot, you didn't want to get your suit. So that first thing could happen biologically. And we could go, even swear. Right? It's all part of the circumstance. The example sometimes I use is you parked your car at the shopping center, you've done your shopping, you come back with your car, and when you turn the corner, you see the side of your car has been wiped out by a big truck. The doors are squashed in. And this notion that there's not going to be a biological reaction, the imagination that we have, the belief, is akin with just imagine, we come around the corner, we see our car, we keep walking, we put the shopping in the back, we go to the door and we try to open it, pulling it, go around the other side. It's unrealistic. Is when we come around the corner and we see the car, it's like either we'll start crying or we'll start laughing or we'll start swearing. But that's a biological reaction, it makes complete sense based on the circumstance. The suffering kicks in when the guilt, I knew I shouldn't have parked on this corner. I've seen other people get, I shouldn't have done it. I feel terrible, I feel guilt and shame. Or the blame towards the driver that did this and he didn't leave his number or anything like that. And then seeing that now I'm not going to be able to do what I wanted to do today, and the resistance to life being different. So that tends to be horizontal in time, well after the biological reaction. And so that's where we can start to see that the biological reaction is something that isn't suffering, And then the psychological reaction is an extension of the story about what should have happened and shouldn't have happened in time. And that, I'm creating this distinction between biological and psychological. Not in order for the mind to say, oh, biological is okay and psychological is not okay. That would be, once again, expectation of how life should look, that life should be without suffering. The biological and the psychological, there's a distinction created. But frankly, the principle on which they arise is exactly the same. Your genes and up-to-date conditioning that you weren't in control of, that is in place in a particular moment. So if suffering arises, it arises because the belief in personal doership is in place, not something you put in place, not something you're in control of it removing. It's a happening. And so our attitude at some point needs to be one of equanimity with the suffering. Which means, equanimity means an acceptance of the suffering. But it's not an acceptance you do, it's simply the absence of the resistance, which was based on the false understanding that I shouldn't be suffering and all of that. So, yeah.
So hi, my question is with this sense of I am. So when you say continuous unbroken peace of mind in daily living, it is my experience that it is synonymous with abiding in the sense of I am, irrespective of the circumstance. That's what happens here. Mm-hmm. And when there's abiding in the sense of I am, the attachment to outcomes is automatically absent because of the completeness and the intrinsic joy that is felt in the moment. It is like maybe something may not happen. It's not necessary for completeness or fulfillment, mm-hmm. but the catch here is continuous unbroken. So my experience is that when there is this sense of I am strongly felt as it is in this moment, mm-hmm. then maybe there isn't the attachment to outcomes or even the sense of doership perhaps. But that sense of I am is not continuously, so there's a flip-flop which keeps happening.
Sure, right.
So when you just mentioned prior that the flip-flop happens between the oneness experience and not so oneness experience, there is a clear distinction there between a oneness experience and a sense of I am in daily living is what my question is.
True.
And the flip-flop can happen, as you said, maybe between a oneness experience and not so, or even between having the sense of I am in daily living and then losing it.
Precisely. So the flip-flopping is actually, really the flip-flopping is about a flip-flopping of our attitude. And the state that delivers the attitude is not so important. So I'm not talking about the flip-flopping of the state, but more so flip-flopping of the attitude. And so what you're saying is where you are familiar with the sense of I am, even without that oneness sense, that is enough to keep us in peace. So it starts to show us that the peace is not directly a result of oneness experience. And frankly, I think that a movement into just being, where you feel the I am, is actually the core of who I am as a human being, whereas the oneness experience tends to be an experience of life that is much less personal and much more impersonal. So it tends to be an experience that is, I'm not the human being, I am awareness, impersonal awareness of source. And I suggest that oneness experience is really there to highlight the awareness and the consciousness that ultimately we find to be the consciousness functioning through the body, which sounds like a regression back because people feel like, I'm identified with the body, and then an awakening happens and I'm now no longer identified with the body. But that's not where the movement is meant to stop, in my experience. It comes back from there, and it then is an integration of a recognition of that consciousness or awareness, whatever word you want to use with it, and see, that's the consciousness that is functioning through the body. When I live as Roger, it is consciousness plus the body that is the Roger experience, not ever independent of each other. It's the combination of the two. And so the sense of I am, where it feels like the heart is the home of I am, then that's where we get to live as the human being, recognizing our core, and we might even feel that it's where I'm connected to Source, where I feel, what I am is impersonal consciousness of Source, linked to a particular body-mind organism, functioning through that body-mind organism as personal consciousness, the experience you're having in this moment. And in this moment, that experience can include the sense of being and I am in it, or that can fade away. And so when it fades away, then we sort of lose that connection to Source. We lose that connection to the core of who we are. And suffering can come back. And so the reference to continuous unbroken peace of mind is a reference to where the process can end up. Along the way, we will find that it's not continuous unbroken peace of mind. It gets broken. But as this resting in being happens more and more, and the recognition of suffering as being based on this, these doership and attachment principles, and we start getting our own evidence that that's not how life really is, means that the connection to Source, or the resting in being, remains more and more robust, until at some point we look back in time and we think, I haven't been suffering for 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 6 months. And then we can conclude, it's happened. We don't even know when it happened exactly. But we find, my peace of mind remains continuous, unbroken, regardless of the circumstance. Whereas I remember 6 months ago, it was flip-flopping. And so this change can be very gradual. And that's why I say you can look back and you go, actually, over the last 3 weeks, I haven't suffered. And then if that 3 weeks turns into 3 months, and then 6 months, then you say, wow, I'm not doing anything. I didn't have any great flash that was some special moment where everything radically changed. You might have had awakening experiences that were very spontaneous and radical. But the process of deliverance meaning that process after the awakening or after the actual realization, I simply cannot be the doer. That process is gradual, and it could be not so spectacular. You just look back and go, I'm at peace. And that only tends to happen when we become very convinced that what we're really looking for is happiness, and all of the other subtle expectations fall away. The subtle expectations that are sometimes put in place by the very teachings that have actually progressed us. Actually, not put in place by the teachings, put in place by our relationship, our interpretation of the teachings.
So is the continuous unbroken peace of mind eventually the stabilization of I am in daily living, where we do not move away from it irrespective of the circumstance?
Yes, that's right. Where it becomes completely known that actually this is my home. This is where, when I know myself fully as a human being, I function in life doing exactly what I need to do in each moment, having disagreements with people, missing airplanes sometimes, me not performing as someone else would like, and yet I remain connected and aware of my completeness in each moment.
And can we trust that the flip-flopping will eventually lead to that? Because sometimes when, as I said, it fades away, the only thing that is wanted in that moment is for it to come back and rest as that.
Yeah, so that you can start to see as an expectation, and it's more suffering. So when you recognize that, you might say, look, there's expectation, more suffering. So the flip-flopping is a great training ground that, if you're directed correctly, allows you to see for yourself, really see for yourself, all of the different forms of suffering and what you're really looking for. So yes, and in time, according as if destined, but why not? Life has taken you that far, where the flip-flopping means a lot more peace. In theory, it'll end up with continuous unbroken peace of mind. Don't set it up as an objective. As soon as you set it up as an objective, more suffering is bound to come in.
Just one clarification on that you said.
No, okay, but Stefan is waiting. So, But the clarification's fine.
Yeah, it's you said it's unbroken sense of I am, but is it really necessary? Because sometimes there could be, like this afternoon I was just bumping my knee against my bike while getting on. It's a very sharp pain, but there was no suffering, but that was recognized in retrospect. But also there was no sense of I am in that moment.
So I would say that by default, if there's no suffering, the recognition of your I amness is by default there, even if it's not a pronounced or even an
Detectable.
aspect. Yeah, detectable. It's in the background. And that's the point, is that these certain things that come to the foreground, the sense of I am and the awareness, are not necessarily destined to stay there. They're not meant to. It's meant to be there to demonstrate something. And then when it becomes known, it fades into the background. And Ramana points to this, my interpretation anyway, is in his reference to aham sphurana, the bursting forth of I am, where the sense of I am becomes very clearly recognized. Or you could use the same example as referring to the awakening, where the witnessing becomes, and he says that's not the enlightened state, even that will fade away. And sometimes when we're listening to those teachings and they're talking about the absolute, we tend to think, oh, it will fade away, and I'll know what is prior to I am, right? Even more esoteric. So we read this, even that which has burst forth will fade away. And the mind says, it'll fade away and I'll know something even more profound. My interpretation is it's saying this witnessing or this palpable sense of I am, even that can fade away. And if it does, and yet you find yourself not suffering, it means that the connection is always there. There's a knowing always there. It's just automatically functioning in the background. You don't even know about it, except you know that it's happening because suffering isn't arising.
So by inference, not by direct experience even.
Yes, although if you go into meditation, when you sit down at a time when you're quiet and you close your eyes, you find that, it's always there. So you can feel it whenever you like, really, if you sit quietly. But it doesn't necessarily need to be an experiential, continuous, unbroken sense of I am in daily living. It's more about the end of the suffering.
But also if there's some other overwhelming experience like pain or maybe even pleasure, then it may leave less space for that as an experience to be currently experienced.
Yeah, which is not important, as we've said.
Yeah.
The experiencing it. Yeah. So there are situations where the sense of I am gets covered over in experience, but the connection, the deep connection, which might not be experiential, remains intact. So the suffering doesn't arise even when you might go, ow, that's the deep pain, and then you move on, and no suffering arises. But in that moment of deep pain, your attention is not on some sense of I am. And in the same way, if you're talking to someone, having a conversation, your attention could be on the conversation and not on the sense of I am. But if the process has made that home of the human being familiar enough to you, and you've gone back there over and over again, at some point we just rest there, and it doesn't need to be experienced. We're just resting there.
Thank you.
You can? Stefan's waiting very patiently. Okay.
It's okay. You go first.
I have a very short one.
Okay, let's do that, because we're actually almost over. Well, we're over time, but it's not a big drama actually.
So you talked about biological and psychological pain, and I just thought about how would you describe it with shame? That means you would tell me now, please come here in front of the camera and get naked. Mm-hmm. So I guess I would have an uncomfortable feeling with myself, and even 10 minutes later, I guess the feeling would also still be uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. So this is not biological then?
No, I could say that could be biological.
Could be also.
Yeah, there's no reason why you need to be able to do certain things in life. The notion that if you have no attachment to outcome, you can watch your partner having sex with someone else, right? And if you can't do that, then there's attachment and suffering. I don't buy that. There can be a biological preference for certain things, and it doesn't necessarily equate to shame. If you found yourself stripped naked in front of the camera, you can feel biologically uncomfortable, and then afterwards, if there's a story about your inadequacy, or that's what shame essentially is, an inadequacy, that's after the event,
I understand.
then it's more likely to be suffering.
Thanks.
So it's a life situation that I want to talk about, and I need you to tell me that how do your concepts fit into this situation. So let's say life's been depressing, it's been blank, it's been lost. You get up every morning, you have nothing in your life to look forward to. But then, of course, you just can't stay in the bed. You gotta get up, you gotta go face it. That's what daily living is, right? You just can't be feeling depressed. And then you get to work, and I also feel that satsangs it tends to make you a much softer or tender person. But when it comes to your practical life, you gotta have a thick skin. Excuse my language, but then you gotta be a bitch. You gotta be strong, you gotta be tough. You gotta bring the other person down. You gotta be manipulative. You can't just sit back, look at life as a happening, and just be at peace and have other people leave you behind at work.
Okay. Was there more to add?
Well, that's it for now.
Okay. So if you find yourself waking up in the morning with a sense of despair, hopelessness, depression, let's say, that is part of the content of life in that moment, right? It's suffering. And it doesn't make life comfortable. It makes the senses, life is very uncomfortable. Some people can't get out of bed with that feeling, and they stay in bed, and their daily life is staying in bed and not functioning very much. So as you said, life can look anyway, and so it can be that you feel uncomfortable, and yet there's a drive to get you to work still. And when you get to work, you find that the environment is one that's very competitive. People are very attached to outcomes, and if you don't have the will to fight and compete, you automatically get left behind. So that's just a description of a particular work environment. And so the conclusion in that work environment is I have to be tough in order to get somewhere in this field. So we can see that that conclusion can be accurate relative to certain benchmarks, certain situations, like success in this industry requires me to be tough and competitive. So you could say it's an accurate assessment. It might not be, but let's say you've really seen it. It could be an accurate assessment in that particular industry. Maybe that's not the industry to be in. Maybe what keeps us there is this idea that I need to succeed and have this outcome, be successful in that industry. It could be what keeps you there. You might find yourself enjoying your work better in another industry. The idea that surrender makes us complacent and ineffective is not quite right. We can surrender, and what we were talking about before, well, we get surrendered, and yet the biological still has its intelligence. And so if someone is overstepping a boundary, while you're surrendered, it can be, hey, listen, this is the third time you've done this, and I just wanted to let you know that I don't think that what you're doing, stepping over this boundary, is effective or fair. So that can happen as a biological reaction to the circumstance, and from a surrendered point of view, it will be seen as a result of my makeup and the circumstance. And after that, there won't be a blame towards the other for what they did, or a judgment towards myself for whether what I did was, right or not right. It was just a happening. And if that happens without the doership energy in it, it can actually be very effective. It can mean that you get to function without this attachment to outcomes, and yet still be very appropriately equipped to function in a particular circumstance. So this sounds, it's a bit tricky, because what it sounds like is a prescription of how you should act at work. And it's not telling you how you should act at work, it's a description of how we might find ourselves acting at work, functioning at work. But if we find ourselves waking up with this uncomfortableness, which means that somewhere in the system, the doership and attachment to outcome is quite intense on a subconscious level, right? It's something that's been deeply ingrained. Then the attitude at work is probably going to be similar to that. It's going to come from that same source. And so if we recognize this description of the dynamic as simply a description of dynamics, then we surrender to the fact that, okay, this is the way I am, and I can't actually be different in this particular moment. Feel free to go to management courses or anger management courses or how to deal with colleagues more effectively courses. That might actually be new conditioning in life that changes the way that you function at work. But in a particular moment when you function, in this particular moment, then you can say, okay, this is a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning up to now. I might decide to go to some workshop that might then be new conditioning that gets me to function differently. So you might function differently the next week after the workshop. But in each moment, how you function is how you're destined to function. And a surrender to that can be something very liberating, because the belief in personal doership simply hasn't surrendered to our shortcomings, hasn't been able to surrender to the aspects of ourself that don't deliver pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And for us to hear, it's not your doing. You're not the one driving the boat. You're not the one dictating the urges that come up. You're not the one that starts crying at work when everyone else is saying, oh, here she goes again, crying again. Or you're not the one that yells at someone in a very aggressive fashion. That's a happening according to your genes and up to date. I mean, you are the one that does that, but it's not your doing. You couldn't function differently. And so a surrender to that is actually compassion to oneself. It's the end of judging oneself. And it's a surrendering to life looking not the way you want it, but the way that it's destined to be in this moment. So no magic answers here, except the concepts can have an effect.
When you say that life can either be pain or pleasure, but if it's been pain for too long and you just have lost motivation out of your life, you have obviously any sane person is going to look for pleasure. He's going to look how to get out of that depression, but then nothing seems to work out.
Mm-hmm. So if we can see that my seeking for a way out of depression can actually be an intensifying of the uncomfortableness. If we see that the insistence that the depression isn't there. So the depression is an uncomfortableness. It's not only pain, but it's suffering. It's on a level of, I feel uncomfortable with myself, not circumstance, but with myself. And so that is what it is uncomfortableness. If we see that the resistance of that, the movement to insist it's not there, actually intensifies that suffering, then the seeing of it can be what allows a surrender, which says, okay, the suffering is here, but I'm not going to intensify it by resisting it. I've done what I can to get rid of it, and it hasn't worked. So in each moment, do what you can to improve the situation, by all means. Try different things that are available. But once you've done what you can, you've tried what you can, sit back, and the outcome not in your control. And so once you've done everything that you can, the continuous fantasizing about you being able to do something to fix it, or that it's not the way it is, tends, when we are present with it, to be an extra load of suffering on top of the initial primary suffering of depression, let's say.
Can I say something about this?
Into the microphone, if you don't mind.
I do think, though, and correct me if I'm wrong with this being doership, but having reached not the same point, but a point where my life looked really, really, really good on the outside, but inside it was not good for many years. And then I intentionally chose to leave Los Angeles because I felt like I was powerless with all of my doing to break the conditioning that was controlling the way that I was functioning. And so I consciously and intentionally removed myself from everything that I knew, from everything that was comfortable, because I felt like it was the only way for life to undo me. As long as I remained comfortable in an environment where I could function, no matter how strong my intention, no matter how strong my desire, no matter how strong my longing, no matter how painful my misery, my grief, my despair, my inability to function the way I wanted to, I couldn't break it. And the great thing about disillusionment is no therapist, no whatever. I won't go into the list of all the things that I did. But and so for me, that began a journey. I had no wanderlust. I didn't want to go anywhere. I just wanted to be undone, basically. So I feel like, I don't know, that longing, that desire, and the admittance that I couldn't do it did create movement for me to go elsewhere, for the undoing to begin to happen. Mm-hmm. I just felt like, so on one level there's an acceptance, but the acceptance in and of itself can create momentum for an undoing to take place. I don't know. I just felt like that somehow might be apropos.
Yeah, it's useful addition, because on the one hand we say that happiness isn't to be found in circumstance, so it's not about improving your circumstance or changing your circumstance, which can sound like, well, in that case I have to stay in the relationship I'm in or in the job I'm in, and simply it's about my attitude to that relationship and that job. And in theory, yes, it's always attitudinal, not circumstantial, but as you say, that our attitude of doership can be a result of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And so, and we might have put ourselves in certain circumstances, certain relationships, for example, because we were functioning from an attachment to outcomes previously. And if a relationship has been put in place based on a false idea of who we are, we could find ourselves in a relationship that isn't supporting an attitudinal change. And a recognition of this can lead to a circumstantial change. So when you say you consciously and intentionally made a change, I understand the thought was, I need to move. And then the thought might be, oh, I can't move, it's I don't want to, I'm too comfortable here. And then another thought said, no, you have to move. And then I'm going to follow this. This feels true. I know it's a resistance against my attachment to outcomes. That's what's happening, is there's a resistance to the attachment to outcomes, and what maybe is coming from a more an understanding of dynamics. And eventually, if you move and you move out of a circumstance that is actually subconsciously keeping in place certain attitudes, there can be a great liberation from those moves, circumstantial moves. And still, it's not because of your circumstance. The happiness that you might feel after a move like that is not because you've changed circumstance. It's rather because you've changed circumstance that was affecting your attitude. And so you've changed circumstance and your attitude has changed.
Like, I couldn't afford to go into certain mental groups when I was in environments that were completely foreign or uncomfortable. And even though that's a temporary fix, it gave me enough time for things to begin to rewire. And that was powerful to see. And then I could go right back into an old circumstance and I would watch myself pivot back. But I've had a couple years where I would watch this dance happen and I slowly began to feel this unwinding.
So what that means, because you haven't been recorded, so you're saying that you found yourself moving backwards and forwards from circumstances that, well, maybe I'm not paraphrasing this, but you can find yourself in your situation potentially moving towards work scenarios that are still coming from your old conditioning. And so you find yourself going into a situation that's being driven by your old attachment, and then you find yourself moving out of that, saying, no, I'm not going to carry on this movement, and you go back to a place of what feels intuitively correct rather than what feels conditionedly correct. And the more that this movement back and forth, because you keep getting pulled into your old habits for some time, and the more that you find yourself breaking away because you recognize a feeling that exists when you engage in circumstance from your old patterning, then eventually we find ourselves gravitating towards the new more and more than we did originally. So originally we kept getting dragged back to what we were familiar with. So it could be something like, the idea of working in a particular industry is driven by the old attachments to outcomes. And at some point we say, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to follow these prompts. I have to follow some new instruction inside, which can be very scary, because the reason you're following those prompts could be because your family have said that's what's important. Your family have said, this is what I'll support you in, but I won't support you in something different. And so we're attached to outcomes. At some point it's like, actually, the feeling inside is so uncomfortable by moving in that track, in that groove. I'm willing to risk anything. I'm willing to risk losing my family and friends. Those are secondary consequences to this uncomfortableness inside. So sometimes it needs to get really uncomfortable in order for a shift to happen. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm here again tomorrow. Thank you.